The ceremony was perfect. 200 guests, white flowers from floor to ceiling, and a bride so radiant the room could hardly look away. Then Richard Whitmore stood up. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He looked at Olivia Parker standing at the altar in her wedding dress and called her exactly what he believed she was: a poor girl, running a con dressed up in white, reaching for a life she had no right to claim. The minister froze. Every person in those 200 chairs went still. And somewhere outside, a black car was pulling through the gates. The Whitmore estate sat on 40 acres of private land, outside the city, the kind of property that didn't appear on real estate listings because it had never needed to. The main house was colonial in structure, but modern in everything else: floor-to-ceiling windows, manicured hedges, cut into geometric shapes, a private lake visible from the eastern terrace. For a wedding, it was the kind of venue that made guests feel they had been granted access to something exclusive, something earned. That feeling was entirely intentional. Olivia Parker had driven through those gates for the first time 8 months ago, the night Ryan brought her to meet his parents over dinner. She had worn a simple navy dress and carried a bottle of wine she had spent too long selecting. She remembered thinking the house looked like something out of a magazine, beautiful in a way that felt slightly unreal, like it had been staged for an occasion that never quite arrived. Richard Whitmore had shaken her hand that evening with the kind of politeness that communicates nothing. His wife Eleanor had been warmer, genuinely so, in the careful way of a woman who had spent years softening the edges of her husband's judgments without ever directly contradicting them. But it was Richard's eyes that Olivia remembered. Measuring, deciding something before she had even spoken a full sentence. That was 8 months ago. Today she was standing at the altar, inside the estate's outdoor pavilion, wearing a dress that had taken 3 fittings to get right, surrounded by white florals that reached the ceiling, and 200 guests seated in silk-covered chairs. The afternoon light came in at a low angle through the open sides of the pavilion, catching the fabric of her dress and turning it gold at the edges. Ryan was standing across from her, his expression steady and quiet in the way that had always made her feel safe. The minister was speaking. Everything was exactly as it was supposed to be. Ryan Whitmore was not a complicated man to understand, though many people tried to make him one. He was 34, ran the International Development Division of Whitmore Holdings, and had a reputation in business circles for being precise and unusually patient. He didn't perform wealth the way his father did. He didn't need the room to know who he was. When he had first told Olivia he loved her, it had been in her apartment kitchen on an ordinary Tuesday. Said plainly, the way someone states a fact they've held for a while and finally decided to stop keeping to themselves. That was Ryan. He didn't build toward things, he just arrived at them. Olivia had grown up with very little of what surrounded her now. Her mother had raised her in a mid-sized city in Ohio after the divorce, working 2 jobs through most of Olivia's school years. They had a small house, a used car, and the kind of financial life where every large expense required a conversation. Olivia had not gone to a prestigious university. She had worked her way through a state school, taken a job at a mid-level marketing firm after graduation, and built something modest and entirely her own. She was not ashamed of any of it. She had also learned early that people who came from money often made up their minds about people who didn't before the conversation even started. She had told Ryan about her father before she told him almost anything else, not because it was the most important thing about her, but because it was the most complicated. Charles Parker had left when Olivia was young. Not violently, not dramatically. He had simply prioritized work over everything else, until the marriage collapsed and the distance became permanent. He had built his company across Europe and the Middle East, across several decades, traveling more than he was home, calling more than he visited, and sending money in place of presents in a way that Olivia had understood intellectually long before she understood it emotionally. They were not estranged exactly. They talked. They met for dinner when he was in the country. But there was a gap between them that neither had fully addressed, a history of absences that didn't dissolve just because both parties were now adults and civil with each other. Ryan had listened to all of it without interrupting. Then he had said that everyone's family had at least one fault line, and that he'd like to meet Charles whenever Olivia was ready for that to happen. She had loved him a little more for the way he said it, not with pity, not with judgment, just with patience. The Whitmore family had never met Charles Parker. In the months leading up to the wedding, he had been overseas for work, and the one dinner that had been arranged was canceled when a deal he was managing in Frankfurt required him to stay an extra 2 weeks. Richard Whitmore had noted the absence at the time. He had not said much about it directly, but Olivia had caught the look he exchanged with Eleanor at the rehearsal dinner when the subject of her father came up, and someone mentioned he would be flying in the morning of the ceremony. Eleanor had said nothing. Richard had smiled with his mouth only. It was that smile she was thinking about when the minister asked if anyone had reason to object. She had told herself driving to the venue that morning that Richard's opinion of her was not something she needed to carry. Ryan had chosen her. That was what mattered. Whatever Richard thought, whatever reservations he had nursed in private today, was the day those reservations became irrelevant. After the ceremony, she would be Ryan's wife, and even Richard Whitmore could not undo that without undoing his own son. She had been wrong about the irrelevance. Richard stood up from the front row on the left side. He was 61 years old, silver-haired, and built like someone who had played competitive sports in his 20s and maintained the posture long after the sport was gone. He wore a dark suit and an expression Olivia had never seen on him before. Not anger, exactly, but something colder. The look of a man who had already made a decision and was simply executing it. Beside him, Eleanor sat with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes directed at the floor in front of her, the posture of a woman who had known this was coming and had chosen in the end not to stop it. The minister stopped speaking. Richard addressed the room, not his son, not Olivia. He spoke to the assembled guests the way a man speaks to a board meeting, measuring each word, knowing its effect, keeping his voice level. He said Olivia Parker was not who Ryan believed her to be. He said she was a young woman with nothing, no family standing, no financial background, no connections worth noting, who had identified his son as an opportunity and pursued that opportunity with intention. He did not call her a con artist outright. He was too careful for that. But the implication sat in the room like smoke, and everyone in those 200 chairs breathed it in. Olivia did not move. She stood at the altar and held very still the way a person holds still when they understand that any reaction will be used against them. She could feel Ryan's hand tighten around hers. She did not look away from Richard. Richard continued. He said that in any other circumstance, he might have stayed silent out of respect for his son's choices. But this was not any other circumstance. This was the moment before a legal and public commitment was made, and he had a responsibility to his family, to their name, to the legacy that Ryan would one day inherit, to state clearly what he believed to be true. He said Olivia had no one in that room on her side of the aisle who could speak to her character, her background, or her intentions. He gestured toward the chairs on the right where her guests sat fewer in number than the Whitmore side, mostly friends and colleagues, no family beyond her mother in the second row, and a handful of cousins. He made that gesture the way you make a point without having to say the point out loud. Then he looked directly at Ryan. He said the choice was simple. Ryan could end the ceremony, now return to his responsibilities, and retain everything: his position in the company, his equity stake, his full inheritance, and the future that had been built for him across 3 decades. Or he could proceed, and Richard would ensure that every one of those things was removed. Not eventually. Not after negotiation. Immediately. The room was completely silent. Ryan looked at his father for a long moment. Then he looked at Olivia. She watched his face move through something, not doubt, but the processing of a reality he had known was possible, and had chosen not to fully believe until now. She had seen that expression before in smaller versions, in the months when Richard's disapproval had been subtle rather than stated. She had always thought Ryan handled it by not quite accepting that it was as bad as it appeared. Now there was no more managing the distance between what he had hoped and what was real. He turned back toward the minister. He said he was going to marry Olivia Parker. He said it without raising his voice and without looking at his father again when he said it. Richard's expression shifted just slightly, the way a wall shifts when something structural changes behind it. Then it reset into something harder. He told Ryan that decision had consequences, that effective immediately Ryan was removed from his position at Whitmore Holdings, that the inheritance documents would be revised before the week was out, that if Ryan proceeded with this ceremony, he would do so as a man with no claim on anything the Whitmore name had built. He said it in front of 200 people in the middle of a ceremony, in the place where his son was supposed to get married, and he said it without flinching. Olivia felt something settle inside her cold and clear, not fear, not grief, something more like recognition, the understanding that this had always been the possible shape of this day, and that she was now simply standing inside it. She looked at Ryan. His jaw was set. His hand was still in hers. Then Richard said something that landed differently than the rest. He looked at Olivia and asked in front of the entire room why her father wasn't there. He said it conversationally, almost gently, which made it worse. He said it was a significant thing for a man to miss his daughter's wedding. He said it suggested that even the people closest to her didn't consider this event worth showing up for. A few guests shifted in their seats. Olivia heard the murmur start low, spreading across the room, the way murmurs do when a crowd has been given permission to question something they were already wondering about. She kept her voice level when she spoke. She said her father was on his way. Richard smiled. It was the same smile from the rehearsal dinner, mouth-only eyes doing something else entirely. He said that was very nice to hear. The murmur continued. She could feel the room recalibrating her, fitting her into the shape Richard had offered. Poor girl. No father. Reached too high. It was a story people recognized because they had heard versions of it before, and recognition has a way of standing in for evidence. What no one in that room knew, what Richard Whitmore had never bothered to find out, was who Charles Parker actually was. Not as Olivia's absent father, not as the man who had missed dinners and sent apology calls from hotel rooms in other countries, but as a person who existed in the world, independent of his relationship to his daughter. A person with a name that meant something in rooms like this, and in rooms considerably more powerful than this one. Olivia took her phone from the small clutch her mother had passed her during the commotion, a quiet, practical gesture from a woman who had always prepared for the moment when things went wrong. She opened a message thread. Charles had texted her 20 minutes ago to say he had landed and was already close, that he was waiting just outside the estate until she told him to come in. She typed 4 words, "Come in right now," and put the phone away. She looked at Ryan. He looked back at her. Neither of them spoke, but something passed between them that needed no translation, a confirmation that whatever came next, they were going to stand in it together. Outside, beyond the manicured hedges and the private lake and the gates at the end of the long drive, a convoy of black vehicles that had been idling quietly on the road began to move. Richard did not sit back down. That was the first thing Olivia noticed. After Ryan's declaration, his father remained standing, one hand resting on the back of the front row chair, the other loose at his side, the posture of a man who had not finished what he came to do. The minister had not moved either. He stood at the altar with his hands folded around his book, looking between the groom and the father with the expression of someone who had officiated hundreds of ceremonies and never once prepared for this particular scenario. Richard looked at the minister and told him to stop the ceremony. Not as a request, as an instruction delivered to a member of staff. The minister looked at Ryan. Ryan said nothing, but the set of his shoulders said enough. The minister did not speak. Richard turned to the room, then, and what he did next was more calculated than anything he had said before. He didn't escalate. He lowered his voice, which forced the 200 guests to lean slightly forward to hear him, which had the effect of drawing them in rather than pushing them away. He said he understood that this was uncomfortable. He said he took no pleasure in it. He said that any father who loved his son would do exactly what he was doing now, not out of cruelty, but out of the kind of care that sometimes required difficult honesty in difficult moments. It was a masterful reframe. Olivia recognized it immediately. He had shifted from aggressor to protector in 3 sentences, and half the room had followed him there without realizing they had moved. He continued. He said the question he had raised about Olivia's father wasn't a personal attack. It was simply an observation. A man's absence from his daughter's wedding was a fact, not an accusation. He said he hoped the explanation when it arrived would be sufficient. He said it the way someone says a thing they fully expect will not come true. Several guests on the Whitmore side nodded. Olivia saw it. She cataloged it the way you catalog things when you know the information will matter later, and you cannot afford to react to it now. Her mother, Margaret, sat in the second row on the right side of the aisle. She was a small woman with a straight back and eyes that missed very little. She had not made a sound since Richard stood up, but Olivia could see from the altar that her mother's hands were clasped tightly in her lap, the knuckles slightly pale. Margaret had driven 4 hours to be here. She had helped Olivia into her dress that morning in the hotel room down the road, smoothing the fabric at the shoulders and telling her she looked exactly right. She had not said anything about Richard Whitmore, though Olivia knew her mother had formed her opinion of the man at the rehearsal dinner and had kept it politely to herself ever since. Watching her now, Olivia thought that the politeness had probably cost her mother considerably more than it appeared. Ryan spoke. He addressed his father directly, his voice even, and said that the ceremony would continue. He said that whatever Richard chose to do with the inheritance was Richard's decision to make, and that he had heard it clearly and accepted it. He said it without drama, without anger, with the same flat steadiness he brought to every negotiation Olivia had ever watched him conduct. It was, she thought, the most she had ever admired him. Richard's expression shifted slightly. He had expected more resistance or more collapse, one or the other. The calmness seemed to recalibrate something in him, and what came out of that recalibration was sharper. He said he was not simply discussing inheritance. He said that proceeding with this ceremony would be a public declaration that Ryan had chosen to align himself with someone whose background and family standing were unknown, unverifiable, and beneath the standard the Whitmore name required. He said this was not about money. It was about what the family represented, and what associating that name with Olivia Parker, a woman whose own father could not be bothered to appear, would communicate to everyone in that room and beyond it. The murmur moved through the crowd again. Olivia heard fragments of it, not words exactly, but the tone of people who had come to a wedding and were now reconsidering the bride they had been prepared to welcome. One of the men on the Whitmore side, a heavy-set man in his late 50s, who Olivia knew was a longtime business associate of Richard's, stood up and said that Richard was making a reasonable point. He said it with the confidence of someone who had never in his life been on the wrong side of a room. He said that family character mattered, and that if Olivia's family was unwilling or unable to show up and be accounted for, that raised questions that deserved answers before anyone signed anything legal. No one on Olivia's side responded. Her friends were not people who moved in these circles or knew how to respond to a man like that in a room like this. They stayed quiet. The silence on her side of the aisle became in that moment its own kind of statement, not because they lacked loyalty, but because they lacked the particular vocabulary that these rooms demanded. Richard seized it. He said he was going to ask the staff to begin clearing the reception arrangements. He said this was not a decision he made lightly, but that the ceremony as planned would not be proceeding. He looked toward the back of the pavilion and gave a small nod to a man in a dark jacket standing near the entrance. The estate's head of security, a man named Davis, who had worked for the Whitmore family for over a decade. Davis straightened, but did not move, yet waiting. Ryan said if Olivia was being asked to leave, then he would leave with her. Richard said that was Ryan's choice to make, and that he would live with the consequences of it. The two men looked at each other across the pavilion, father and son separated by 30 feet of white-carpeted aisle, and something considerably wider than that. And the room understood it was watching something that had been building for longer than this afternoon. This was not only about a wedding. This was a reckoning between two people who had been moving toward it for years, and today had simply been the day it arrived. Eleanor had not moved from her seat in the front row through any of it. She sat with the same folded hands and the same downward gaze, and Olivia understood, watching her, that Eleanor's stillness was not indifference. It was the particular stillness of a woman who had spent a long time knowing that certain things could not be stopped, and had arrived at something resembling resignation without ever quite arriving at peace. Olivia stood very still at the altar. She was aware of her dress of the flowers of the afternoon light that had shifted since the ceremony began, and was now coming through the pavilion at a different angle, flatter and less warm. She was aware of the minister beside her, of Ryan a step away, of her mother in the second row. She was aware that the moment she had most feared, the one she had told herself repeatedly would not happen, could not happen, was too extreme even for Richard Whitmore, had happened, and was continuing to happen, and that there was very little she could do to accelerate what she was waiting for. She had sent the message. He was already on his way in. She knew only that he was not a man who said things he did not intend to follow through on. That, at least, was one of the things she had learned about her father across the years of distance between them. Whatever else Charles Parker was or was not, he did not make commitments casually. Richard spoke again. He directed his words at Olivia this time, not at Ryan, not at the room. He said he wanted her to understand something clearly. He said he did not dislike her personally. He said he was sure she was, in her own context, a perfectly reasonable person. He said the problem was not Olivia Parker, the individual. The problem was what Olivia Parker represented: a gap in the record, an unknown quantity, a blank space where a family history and a network and a set of verifiable credentials should have been. He said that in his world, blank spaces were not innocuous. They were risks, and he did not take risks with his family's future. It was, Olivia thought, possibly the most civil way anyone had ever told her she was nothing. She looked at him steadily and said that her father would be there shortly. Richard made a small sound, not quite a laugh, but adjacent to one. He said he looked forward to meeting him. The way he said it made clear he expected the meeting to confirm everything he already believed. A woman 2 rows back on the Whitmore side, someone's wife in a pale green dress, leaned toward the man beside her and said something behind her hand. Both of them looked at Olivia. Then the woman looked away, as though the looking itself had been a courtesy she was no longer obligated to extend. That small motion, the turning away, landed harder than anything Richard had said. It was not dramatic. It cost the woman nothing. It was simply the natural behavior of people who have decided which side of a line they are on and are no longer interested in anything happening on the other side. Olivia had seen that motion before, in smaller rooms, in smaller situations. She had never expected to see it at her own wedding. Ryan moved closer to her. He said her name quietly, not asking anything, just locating himself next to her in the room. Richard said he was giving them 5 minutes to make a final decision. He said after 5 minutes, Davis would begin the process of clearing the venue, and the guests would be invited to move to the main house for refreshments, while the family handled the situation privately. He said it with the tone of a man managing logistics, as though this were a scheduling problem and not the destruction of his son's wedding. Some of the guests began gathering their things, not many, perhaps a dozen, on the edges of the seating, but enough to signal the direction the room was moving. The momentum was shifting. Olivia could feel it the way you feel a current when you're standing in water, not violent, just persistent, pulling everything in one direction. Ryan said to Olivia quietly that they could leave. He said they could go right now, get in a car, and be married somewhere else by the end of the day. He said he meant every word he had said at the altar, and that none of what was happening in this room changed that. He said it with his face close to hers, low enough that only she could hear. She told him she knew. She told him to wait another few minutes. He looked at her, and she saw him read something in her expression that she hadn't said out loud. He didn't ask what she was waiting for. He simply nodded and stayed where he was. Richard announced that the ceremony was over. He said it to the room, not to Ryan, not to Olivia. He said it the way you close a meeting. He thanked the guests for their attendance and said the family appreciated their understanding during what was clearly an unexpected and difficult situation. Several people began to stand. Davis took a step forward from his position near the entrance, and then one of the guests near the back of the pavilion turned toward the entrance. Then another. Then a third and a fourth, until a slow rotation of attention moved through the seated crowd, like a wave traveling from the back of the room to the front, each person turning to look at whatever was happening outside. The sound came first, not loud, just present. The low sound of multiple vehicle engines coming to a stop on gravel. More than one car. More than two. The particular sound of a convoy that knew where it was going and had arrived without hesitation. Davis, near the entrance, looked out through the pavilion's open side. His expression changed. Not dramatically. Davis was a professional, but it changed. He took a step back from where he had been standing, as though he needed slightly more room than he had previously required. Richard frowned. He looked toward the entrance with the expression of a man who is used to being the most significant person in any given space, and has just registered, without yet understanding why that something is different about this particular moment. Outside on the long gravel drive that curved past the private lake and through the manicured hedges of the Whitmore estate, 4 black vehicles had come to a stop in a precise line. The doors opened. 2 men in dark suits stepped out first, then a third. Then a man in his early 60s stepped out of the second vehicle. He was tall, silver-haired, dressed in a charcoal suit that had clearly been put on in a hurry, but sat on him with the ease of someone for whom clothes of that quality were entirely ordinary. He looked at the pavilion. He looked at the estate. And then he walked toward the entrance with the unhurried certainty of a man who had never in his life needed to announce himself. In the 3rd and 4th rows on the Whitmore side, 2 men recognized him before anyone else did. One of them was a senior partner at a financial firm that had spent the better part of the previous year trying to schedule a meeting with Parker Global's executive team. The other had attended a conference in London 3 years earlier, where this man had given a keynote address to an audience of 1,200 people, all of them considerably more powerful than anyone seated in this pavilion. Both men went very still. Richard Whitmore had not yet recognized him. He was still watching the entrance with the tolerant, slightly impatient expression of a man who expected to see exactly what he had predicted, a middle-aged nobody, late to his daughter's wedding, arriving too far into the damage to do anything about it. He had already composed the look he intended to give. Understanding. Dismissive. The look of a man who has won and is gracious enough not to rub it in. He had not yet looked at the faces of the men who had recognized the figure walking through the entrance. If he had, he might have understood sooner that what was about to happen was nothing like what he had predicted. Charles Parker walked into the pavilion. He did not look at Richard Whitmore. He looked at his daughter. The room did not react all at once. It happened in layers. The 2 men in the 3rd and 4th rows who had recognized Charles first were already on their feet before he had fully crossed the entrance threshold. They rose with the automatic deference of people who have spent enough time in professional environments to understand that certain presences require a physical acknowledgement regardless of context. Neither of them said anything. They simply stood, and the people beside them noticed and began looking around to understand what they had missed. Charles walked down the side of the pavilion, not the center aisle, moving with the kind of economy that comes from a lifetime of entering rooms that were not expecting him. He was not performing his arrival. He was simply arriving. He looked at Olivia the entire time, and she watched him come toward her with an expression that she could not entirely control, something between relief and a grief she had not known she was carrying until this moment when it shifted. He reached the altar. He stood beside her, looked at her face, and said he was sorry he was late. He said it quietly, meant only for her, in the tone of someone delivering an apology that covers considerably more ground than the words themselves suggest. Olivia said he was here now. Her voice was steady. Her mother, Margaret, in the second row, pressed one hand flat against her collarbone and looked at the ceiling for a moment. Richard Whitmore had still not fully processed what he was looking at. He had registered the reaction in the room, the standing, the attention, the way the energy in the pavilion had reorganized itself toward the entrance, but his mind had not yet supplied the correct explanation. He was still operating inside the story he had written, which had a specific character in the role of Olivia's father, a man of no consequence, arriving too late to matter, confirming by his very appearance everything Richard had already argued. The man standing at the altar did not fit that character. The suit was wrong for it. The posture was wrong for it. The way two of his most senior business contacts were standing and looking at this man with undisguised recognition was very wrong for it. Richard looked at the man beside his business associate in the third row. The associate was leaning slightly forward the way people lean when they are trying to make sense of something they are not sure they are seeing correctly. Richard caught his eye. The associate gave a small, careful nod that communicated something Richard did not yet want to accept. Charles turned from Olivia and looked at Richard Whitmore for the first time. He did not cross the pavilion to reach him. He simply looked at him from where he stood, with the particular quality of attention that belongs to people who are accustomed to taking in a situation completely before responding to any part of it. Richard said, with the tone of a man maintaining control of a room he suddenly felt less certain about, that he was glad Olivia's father had made it. He said it was a shame the timing had not worked out better. Charles said the timing was fine. He said he had been outside the gates for the past 20 minutes, waiting in the car for Olivia's message telling him to come in. He explained that his assistant had patched his phone into a call with one of his team members inside the venue, someone who had arrived ahead of him and had been present in the pavilion from the start of the ceremony. He said he had listened to everything from the car. He looked at Richard and let that information settle without adding anything further to it. The room absorbed that. Several guests looked at each other. The woman in the pale green dress who had turned away from Olivia earlier was now facing forward with an expression that had rearranged itself entirely. Richard said he wasn't sure what Charles believed he had heard, but that this was a private family matter, and he was welcome to join his daughter in stepping outside while it was resolved. Charles said he appreciated the invitation. He said he would be staying. There was a quality to how he said it that made the invitation retroactively absurd, not through aggression, but through the simple weight of a man who had spent decades in rooms where the stakes were considerably higher than this one, and had learned that the most effective response to someone trying to move you was to remain exactly where you were. Richard looked at the two men who had stood up. He looked at them with an expression that was asking a question. The senior partner from the financial firm, a man named Gerald, who had known Richard for over 15 years, answered it by saying, in a voice the nearest 2 rows could hear, that Charles Parker was the founder and chairman of Parker Global. The name landed differently on different people in the room. For the guests who moved in finance and industry, it landed like a door opening onto a much larger space than the one they thought they had been sitting in. Parker Global operated across 3 continents. Its annual revenue put it in a category that made Whitmore Holdings look like a regional concern. The 2 men had not stood out of courtesy. They had stood out of the same reflex that makes people get to their feet when a judge enters a courtroom. Richard's face did something complicated. The architecture of his certainty was still visible. The jawline, the posture, the set of the shoulders, but something behind it had shifted, like a building whose foundation has moved while the facade remains intact. He said he was familiar with the name. Charles said that was good. He said it would save some time. He looked around the room once, briefly taking in the guests, the flowers, the altar, the minister who had still not moved. Then he looked back at Richard and said he was going to say one thing, and he would say it clearly. He said he had built Parker Global across 30 years without ever once conducting himself the way Richard Whitmore had conducted himself in the last hour. He said that in his experience, the men who built things by diminishing others were rarely building anything that lasted. He said he had made mistakes in his own life, more than he was proud of, and his daughter knew most of them, but that humiliating a young woman in front of 200 people on the day of her wedding was not a category of mistake he had ever made, and he found it difficult to extend much professional respect to a man who had. The room went quiet in a way that felt different from before, not the held breath of a crowd waiting to see which way something would fall, but the stillness that follows something final. No one reached for a response because the room understood instinctively that there was no response available that would not make things worse. Richard said that Charles was welcome to his opinion, but that this situation concerned his family and his company's future, and those were not subjects on which outside commentary was relevant. Charles said he understood. He said he also wanted Richard to know that Parker Global had been in preliminary discussions with 3 financial institutions about a significant investment partnership, the kind of capital injection that could stabilize a mid-tier holding company through the market correction that most analysts expected within the next 18 months. He said the name Whitmore Holdings had come up in those conversations as a possible vehicle for one portion of that investment. He said he expected Richard already knew about those conversations, given that Richard's own CFO had been part of 2 of the preliminary calls. Richard said nothing. His CFO, a thin man named Hargrove, seated 4 rows back, had gone the color of old paper. Charles said he wanted to be straightforward. He said the investment would not be moving forward through Whitmore Holdings. He said this was not a negotiating position. It was a decision made in the last 45 minutes final and not subject to further discussion. He said he generally did not conduct business on the basis of personal sentiment, but that he also did not place significant capital into organizations led by men whose judgment he had fundamental questions about, and that today had given him very clear answers to questions he had not known he needed to ask. A sound moved through the room, not a murmur, but something closer to the collective intake of breath that happens when an audience watches something irreversible occur. Richard said that pulling an investment over a family disagreement was not how serious business was conducted. Charles said he agreed completely. He said this was not about a family disagreement. It was about a pattern of behavior that reflected how a man led, and how a man led was directly relevant to whether his company was a sound place to put capital. He said he had seen enough in the past hour to make that assessment with confidence. He thanked Richard for the clarity. Several things happened in the following minutes, not dramatically, but with the quiet efficiency of consequences that had been set in motion and could no longer be stopped. Gerald, the financial partner in the 3rd row, took out his phone. The man beside him did the same. Neither of them made calls in the room. They were too professional for that. But the motion of reaching for the phone communicated everything. Information was moving. The news of what Charles Parker had said and what he had decided would reach the relevant people before the afternoon was out. Ryan had been standing beside Olivia through all of it, close enough that their arms were touching. He had not spoken during the exchange between his father and Charles, and Olivia understood why. This was not his conversation to enter, but she felt him beside her, entirely present, and that presence had been its own kind of statement from the moment his father stood up. Charles looked at Ryan. He took a moment, and what he said next was directed at the groom rather than the patriarch. He said he had learned things about Ryan Whitmore through Olivia over the past year, not through introductions or meetings, because those had not happened, but through the way his daughter talked about the people in her life. He said that the people Olivia trusted were not always people who had earned trust easily, but they were always people who had been consistent. He said that what Ryan had done today, choosing his wife over his inheritance in public, in front of the people whose opinion his family had spent decades managing, was not a small thing. He said a man's choices under pressure were the only reliable data point, and that today had given him a very clear one. Ryan said he appreciated that. He said he also wanted to say directly to Charles that he was sorry they had not met before this. He said that was a failure of his, and that he intended to do considerably better going forward. Charles looked at him for a moment. Then he said that was a reasonable thing to say, and that he would hold him to it. Olivia felt something shift inside her that was difficult to name. It was not happiness exactly, or not only happiness. It was the particular sensation of watching two things that have been separate for a long time begin to occupy the same space. Her father standing at the altar of her wedding, her husband speaking to him with the same directness he brought to everything. The gap that had always existed in her life, the one she had stopped expecting to close doing something unexpected. Richard Whitmore had not left the room yet. He was still standing near the front row, but the geography of the pavilion had reorganized around him in a way that left him outside its center. The guests who had been nodding along with him earlier were no longer looking in his direction. Davis had stepped back to his original position near the entrance, the earlier instruction effectively withdrawn by the change in the room's gravity. Eleanor remained in her seat, still her hands still folded, though something in her posture had shifted a slight drop in the shoulders, as though a tension she had been holding for a very long time had finally been released, and she was not entirely sure what to do with the absence of it. Richard said to no one in particular, and therefore to everyone that he had made decisions today that he believed were correct. No one responded to that. He said that the business relationship with Parker Global was a separate matter from the family situation and should be treated as such. Charles said he had already addressed that point and did not intend to revisit it. The finality in that sentence was absolute. Richard heard it. The room heard it. Richard looked at his son, and for just a moment the architecture of certainty dropped entirely, and what was underneath it was something older and less constructed. A father looking at a son who had just become unreachable in a way that had nothing to do with geography or corporate structure. Ryan looked back at him without anger, and without the softness that might have offered an opening. He simply looked. The way you look at a version of a relationship you have finally understood is over. The minister who had remained at the altar for the entirety of the last hour, with a composure that deserved some form of recognition, cleared his throat quietly and asked if the ceremony would be continuing. Ryan looked at Olivia. She looked at her father. Charles gave a small nod, not permission exactly because this was not his to permit, but something more like confirmation. A closing of a longer story and the opening of a different one. Ryan said yes. The ceremony would continue. The guests who had begun gathering their things sat back down. The ones who had been standing found their seats. The minister opened his book to the place he had marked when everything stopped, and the light that had gone flat during the long hour of Richard's interruption found the pavilion again through the open sides of the structure, warmer than before, coming in at an angle that caught the white flowers and turned the edges of Olivia's dress gold, the same way it had at the very beginning, before any of this happened, when everything was still exactly as it was supposed to be. Richard Whitmore left the pavilion before the vows were spoken. He walked out through the entrance without a word, and Davis followed at a discreet distance, and the sound of his footsteps on the gravel outside faded as the minister began again. In the weeks that followed, the consequences arrived in the quiet administrative way that serious consequences usually do. Parker Global's withdrawal from the Whitmore Holdings investment discussions reached the financial press within 48 hours. The company's stock moved in the direction that stock moves when a significant expected capital infusion fails to materialize. The board convened an emergency session. Richard's resignation was announced in a brief statement 11 days after the wedding, citing a desire to pursue new opportunities, the kind of language that means the opposite of what it says. Ryan received a legal notice from his father's attorneys 7 days after the ceremony regarding the inheritance documents. He read, "It said it on the kitchen counter and told Olivia they would figure it out." She told him she knew. They had both known from the moment Ryan spoke at the altar that the figure they would build from this point forward would be their own. Charles flew back to London 3 days after the wedding. Before he left, he had dinner with Olivia, just the two of them, at a quiet restaurant away from the estate and the city, and everything that had happened. They did not talk about Richard Whitmore or Parker Global or the investment. They talked about the years they had missed carefully at first, and then less carefully, the way a conversation goes when two people have been waiting a long time to have it, and have finally run out of reasons not to. He told her he had regrets. She told him she knew that too. They did not resolve everything in one dinner, because 30 years of distance does not dissolve over a single meal, but they made an agreement, unspoken and clear, to keep talking. That was enough for now. That was, in fact, considerably more than she had allowed herself to expect. Richard Whitmore, in the years that followed, would occasionally be asked by people who knew him what he had lost in the Whitmore Holdings, restructuring, whether it was the capital, the position, or the reputation that had cost him most. He always gave an answer about business, about market timing and investor confidence, and the particular difficulty of navigating corporate transitions at a certain stage of a company's development. He gave that answer because it was the one he knew how to give, and because the other answer, the one about a son who had stopped calling, and a daughter-in-law who sent polite holiday messages that conveyed exactly as much warmth as they were intended to convey, which was not very much, was not an answer that fit neatly into the language he had always used to describe the things that mattered. He had walked into a pavilion on a Saturday afternoon, believing he was protecting something valuable. He had walked out having traded the things that could not be replaced for the things that already were.